Good day everyone. Today, I will be discussing to you the topic in Survey of English and American Literature in course packet 4 under the American Romanticism and New England Transcendentalism, which is The Murders in Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. But before that, let us look for the objectives of this packet. At the end of the discussion, the student will be able to describe the American literature in line with the social and historical background of America during the period of colonization and revolution. Second, you will be able to recognize the importance of war for independence as an influence in American literature. And lastly, the student will be able to develop patriotism and love of country. The Murders in Rue Morgue is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1841 in the Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, Philadelphia, and then in Poe's own short story collection in 1845 entitled Tales of Misery and the Imagination. So Rue Morgue is one of the first modern detective stories ever. The whole idea of the detective was still new at this point. The first detective agency in the world was founded in Paris in 1817 by all-around adventurer and awesome guy Eugene Francois Vidocq. So, just 24 years before Poe published his story, an unnamed narrator tells the story in first-person point of view. In fact, many people claim that the character of Dupin himself is based on Vidocq's diary. So, as a writer of fiction, Poe took the process of using clues to figure out the identity of a criminal and used it in creating what he called tales of ratiocination. So in other terms, it is the stories of deduction, in which there's a mystery and it's the job of the protagonist to look at all the evidence and reasons his way to the answer. So in Poe's Dupin stories, it's not just the main character or the main man who is trying to work out who the culprit is, but also us, the reader. So, anything in the story, no matter how minor, who would be benefits of whodunit. So, when we say whodunit, it is a story or play about a murder in which the identity of the murderer is not revealed until the end. So, we're supposed to use our knowledge of human nature to figure out what the answer has to be. So, The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a story, but it is also a challenge not just for the hero but also for the reader. So, by the way, Poe wrote two more Dupin stories entitled The Misery of Marie Roget in 1842 and the Purloined Letter in 1844. So, before I discuss the character, the settings and the themes, let's just move on to the summary of the story. So the story opens with the discovery of the violent murder of an old woman and her daughter. So no grisly details is spared in the description of the crime scene as it is discovered by neighborhoods responding to the woman's screams. So the police are baffled by the fact that the murderers has managed to escape even though the woman's apartment appears to have been completely sealed from the inside. So the genteel but impoverished C. Auguste Dupin and his nameless friend who narrates the story offer their services to the police, and though a brilliant interpretation of the clues at the scene, they identified the murderer as an escaped orangutan. So they concluded that the murderer was an orangutan because when Dupin visits the scene of the crime and inspect the gray hair and other items found in the house, he immediately begins to doubt whether a man could have committed the crime at all. So Dupin wonders how any man would have the strength to shove a fighting fully grown woman up to a chimney or to slash a throat so brutally that woman's head would fall off when moved. So he also wonders about how the killer escaped and begins to think about the possibility that the killer has the special ability to climb and jump from a great distance. So the power that would be possessed by another kind of primitive other than man is an orangutan. So he tells the police that he believed that the murderer was committed by an orangutan. So in its presentation of an amateur detective who uses ratiocination to solve an apparent inexplicable mystery, the story shaped a new genre of fiction, and a Dupin stamp can be seen on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, Dame Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, and the protagonist of dozens of others. Because it was Poe's first tale of ratiocination, the Murders in the Rue Morgue introduces more basic features of detective fiction than any of Poe's other short stories. Among these basic features of three central ideas, the first one is the murder occurs in locked room from which there is no apparent egress or exit. So in later detective fiction, this idea expanded, though essentially retained, and it is used when the author sets the scene of the murder in a closed environment. So that is on a train where the murderers is included among the passengers, on an island where the murderers must logically still be there, or on an estate where the murderer has to be among the people in the house, or in this particular story, with there being no way for the murderer to escape, the police are completely baffled. So the second central ideas is motive, access, and other surface evidence point to an innocent person. So frequently, in detective fiction, the amateur detective is drawn into the case because a friend or acquaintance has been falsely accused, as is Libon. So Libon is also known as Adolphe de Bon, who once rendered Mr. Dupin a service for which he is not ungrateful. Thus, Mr. Dupin is drawn into the case because of the obligation to the accused. Because in the story, Mr. Libon was falsely accused. He is a bank clerk who delivered the gold coins to the ladies the day before the crime scene. That is why he was arrested, even though there is no other evidence linking him to the crime. So the third central idea is the detective uses some sort of unexpected means to produce the solution. We have noted above that all of the clues should be present, but nevertheless, the appeal of detective fiction lies in the unexpected solution, which is become logical only in retrospect. Now let's move on to the character analysis. So Mr. Auguste Dupin is a man in Paris who solved the mystery of the brutal murder of two women. So numerous witnesses heard a suspect which appeared to be the sound of the hooting ape. Though no one agrees on what language was spoken, at the murder scene, Dupin finds a hair that does not appear to be a human. So Dupin solved the cases through the use of tales of ratiocination, or the methods of deduction. So Dupin was the original model for the detective in literature. So Mr. Dupin is just a fictional detective appearing in the three stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Let's move on now to the tone of the story. So the tone of the story is curious and suspenseful. This narrator is constantly saying things like, "Tell me for heaven's sake the method," and "You astonish me," and "How was it possible?" So the narrator's constantly commentary on Dupin's detective crazy shenanigans keeps up the reader's interest. So after all, since the narrator is so intrigued by the details Dupin lays out, maybe we should too. So the curious mode of the story maintains the freshness of the central mystery as it continues across numerous pages. After all, there isn't much emotion involved in all of this, so Poe has to find something else to draw in the reader's attention, and that something else is the overall tone of intellectual interest and suspense. Now let's move on to the genre of the story. So the genre of the story is mystery. So it was tough for us to let go of the genre of horror. For the Murderers in the Rue Morgue, after all, Poe is the author of the Cask of Amontillado, so where someone gets buried alive, and the Telltale Heart, which features a murderer's victim under the floorboards, and happens to be the master of writing stories to freeze the blood. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is a good candidate for horror because of the real distinguishedness of the murder, which is the lady's head thus falls off. So it is pretty horrifying, but while all of these details make the murderers terrifying to the neighborhood, What puts this story in the genre of mystery is the matter-of-fact way that the story lays out its grossest element like a checklist. So the readers doesn't have a lot of emotional investment in what's going on. In fact, the only thing that important is surveying all the clues that story gives us and trying to solve the matter along with genius detective Dupin. So this story is effectively a puzzle, so both for its protagonist and its reader, putting it squarely into the genre of mystery. The settings of the story is in the Paris during the 19th century. So the first detective agency in the world was found in Paris by a man Poe admires enough to the guy a shout out in the Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is Francois Vidocq. So the setting in the story was in a Paris. It gives a clear lineage from Vidocq's, which is the first real detective, and to Dupin, which is the first fake detective because Dupin is just a fictional character. So, but here's something that grabbed our attention. Poe never actually visited Paris. Nevertheless, in a short story where the narrators won't even tell us when the tale's taking place, it's striking that it is really specific about where everything's happening. So Dupin and the narrator meet in a library on the Rue Montmartre. So remember the word rue, which is street in French. So the place and Dupin narrator share a time-eaten and rustic mansion in an fashionable and out-of-the-way part of Faubourg Saint-Germain. It is an old-fashioned but still relatively aristocratic part of the left bank in Paris. And the fictional Rue Morgue is placed in a real section of Paris in the Quartier Saint-Roch. So how can Poe is being so precise about the setting of his story? So what are the factors why Poe end up in this setting? So first of all, Paris is a beautiful and fascinating place. Maybe this probably a factor. After all of the section of Paris mentioned in the story has all aristocratic connection that make the Paris Poe described seem exciting to us. There's Montmartre. The fact that the narrator and Dupin meet in this neighborhood would have signaled to anyone who knows Paris that they're both probably sensitive or bohemian artist types. And the revolutionary artistic and intellectual activity of Paris probably seemed pretty awesome to someone trying to break into resistant literary circles in Baltimore, New York, and Boston. So Paris in 1840s, and actually still today, would have been one of the best places in the world for people watching and for playing Dupin's game of creative deduction. So the theme of the story is cunning and cleverness. In the first paragraph of the story, the narrator says that he doesn't want to write a treatise. So in other words, treatise in an essay about his suggestion that reason is always the better for a little imagination and vice versa. However, the Murders in Rue Morgue reads like an essay anyway, even though most essays dispense with murderous monkeys. So the narrator and the protagonist spend a lot of time showing what kind of intelligence are valuable and what kinds are not. So, and the narrator sets up the case of the murders in the Rue Morgue as a proof that superior reasoning allows the woman mind to make guesses and stuff beyond its knowledge, and then back it up with cold, hard evidence. So Dupin distinguishes himself from the police because while they are both analytical and cunning in their way, Dupin has the imagination to think outside of conventional assumptions. Dupin's genius for observation is incompatible with social interaction. That is why he uses human emotion as evidence in his chains of reasoning rather than the means of bonding with others. The second theme is justice and judgment. When we think detective story, we think of something like Law and Order Special Victim Unit or the Mentalist or Cold Case, where the point is to put together all the clues to catch the perpetrator before he can kill again. So those stories are all about judgment. Society can tolerate a killer in its midst, so we have the police to track down evildoers. So we don't know if it is because Poe wrote the first detective story or what, but the Murders in Rue Morgue isn't really like that. So by choosing a non-human killer, Poe neatly sidestepped the question of justice, because an orangutan isn't going to learn any better. So, and Dupin himself is not particularly interested in figuring out the case until a gentleman's obligation comes into it. In other words, he has his own code of honor, but he's not doing this for abstract reasons like protecting society or upholding the law. Neutralizing the question of justice gives Poe more of a license to turn his story into a puzzle. So Dupin's decision to take on the case to repay a favor from Libon shows that he believes more strongly in honor than in justice. So by making the killer of Murders in Rue Morgue an ape, Poe shifts the task of the detective away from moral judgment and towards pure logic. So the third theme is Foreignness and the others. So the narrator of the Murders in Rue Morgue is a stranger in strange land, a man of unknown nationality visiting Paris. While the narrator and Dupin are bonded, he nevertheless often described Dupin especially as Frenchman. So the testimony with regards to the murder case arising from the neighborhoods in the Quartier Saint-Roch is similarly nationally marked. So there's a bunch of French, English, Italian, and Dutch people, all presumably sharing a neighborhood. While Paris is the capital of France, it also comes across in this story as the capital of the world. So with all kinds of people living side by side, there's no sense of rootedness or unified national culture to be found in the midst of thriving urban setting. So in such a dense city space, you expect misunderstanding to come up. And they do, literally. None of the witnesses can agree on the language that they hear spoken over their heads as they race into the house in the Rue Morgue, but they all think it's a foreign language. In a neighborhood in which many nationalities of people exist, cheek by jowl, there's still one boundary that's maintained absolutely. The animal remains foreign. So in other words, whether his or her nation of origin, everyone in Paris is connected by their common status as reasoning, rational human beings. What needs to be excluded to keep up this status quo is the rational emotionalism of the orangutan. So the Murders in Rue Morgue depend on the diversity of modern city life to make its story of a murderous orangutan plausible. So Dupin's coldness and calculation exclude him from society as much the orangutan's extreme emotions do. So lastly, awe and amazement. So the narrator of the Murders in Rue Morgue is upfront about his own personal taste, and when we say upfront, we mean it literally. He spent the first several paragraphs of his story expressing his admiration for certain kinds of thinking, which he finds his pal Dupin. So we sit back and watch him express his awe and this man genius the first few times as we think that he's justifying why he has selected Dupin as the protagonist of his story. But as the story goes on and the narrators meet every new thing Dupin says with mute astonishment, or this is beyond my comprehension, we start to wonder why expressions of amazement are so important to this story. So there are a couple of things that his awe might be doing. First, the narrator's astonishment gives a plot level reason for why Dupin needs to talk through his solutions carefully and slowly. Second, it signals to us that the reader that we're supposed to be similar in awe of what Dupin is doing. And third, it increases the suspense. The gap between the narrator's understanding and Dupin's keeps us on edge as we wonder what Dupin knows that the narrator doesn't know. So the narrator's constantly praise of Dupin's uncommon genius reminds the reader to imitate his method of thinking to solve the puzzle of the story. So the narrator's awestruck responses to Dupin slow down to denouement and step up the suspense of the narrative. So let's sum it up. So the title in plain English of the Murders in Rue Morgue is the Murders on Morgue Street. So as what I've said earlier, Rue is a French word for street. So type of work and publication date, the Murders in Rue Morgue falls into the general category of short story and the specific category of detective story. It was first published in April 1841. An unnamed narrator tells the story in first-person point of view. So the first detective story, The Murders in Rue Morgue, set a milestone in literature as the first detective story ever written. It is sometimes referred to as the tale of ratiocination, the process of using cold objective logic, including deduction and induction, to solve a problem or a mystery. However, the central character of the story, the brilliant amateur detective C. Auguste Dupin, relies as much on intuition as on logic. So, what is an orangutan? So, orang-outang is a modern English called orangutan. In this story, the orangutan is the killer in the Rue Morgue. So, an orangutan is a type of ape indigenous from Borneo and Sumatra. It has long arms and shaggy hair, generally reddish-brown. So the adult male normally attains a weight of between 170 to 185 pounds. Orangutans spend a great deal of time in trees, swinging from limb to limb to move from one tree to another. When they are on ground, they travel on all fours. So that is why when Dupin analyzes the scene, he thinks that the killer is non-human because the killer has the special ability to climb and jump from great distances. The climax of the story of the Murders in Rue Morgue is the sailor reveals details about killing. So that's all for my report. Thank you for listening.